I think China sees a lot of opportunities for the United States to bog down in the region. Its strategic design over this military operation is lacking from Beijing's perspective. US officials threw out too many different justifications: the drugs, immigrants, oil and resources, democratic domino in the region. But eventually, Beijing thinks this reflects overall chaos and impulsive decision making in the Trump White House.
Hello, everybody. Welcome and thank you for joining us today on this conversation on the impacts of developments in Venezuela on China and U.S. China relations. My name is Jesse Marks, and I'm the CEO of Rihla Research and Advisory. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Margaret Myers and Zhao Tong to discuss how the January 3rd, 2026 U.S. military operation that captured Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro is impacting U.S. China relations from the Western Hemisphere to the Taiwan Strait, and what this moment reveals about power, norms, and strategic calculation in today's international system. And briefly, as their bios can be found on the National Committee's website, I have the honor to get to introduce Miss Margaret Myers. She is the Managing Director of Johns Hopkins SAIS Institute for America, China, and the Future of Global Affairs, and Senior Advisor to the Asia and Latin America Program at the Inter-American Dialogue. I also have the privilege of introducing Mr. Zhao Tong, who is a senior fellow at the Nuclear Policy Program and the China Center of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Thank you both for being here with us today. China has deep economic ties with Venezuela, including large oil for loan deals and decades of economic cooperation, energy cooperation. But this move challenged that relationship in some potentially powerful ways and has raised questions about Beijing's strategic foothold in the region. In your view, how do Chinese leaders and policymakers assess the material and strategic value of Venezuela today? And to what extent has the U.S. operation in Caracas undermined or simply complicated Beijing's long-term interests in Venezuela and more broadly in Latin America?
It's a great question, Jesse. And I mean, I think there are kind of two separate questions there. So let me address, first of all, kind of the extent to which this is, a really critically strategic or important relationship for China, right? The China-Venezuela dynamic. It was conceived as such, right? As a really fundamentally important relationship as of about 3 decades ago, I guess now, right? When Chen Yuan, former chairman of China Development Bank, headed to Venezuela in pursuit of, agreements that would ensure the transport of Venezuelan oil to China. And this was at a moment in the mid 1990s, right, when China was really thinking very critically about its energy security, when equity oil investment overseas was part of that overall equation and something that China, through the banks and other mechanisms, was looking to pursue. And indeed, a lot of the large scale, multi-billion dollar lending arrangements that we've all heard about between China and Venezuela were the result of that dynamic and transpired in following years, right? Really up until 2015 or so. We saw $50 billion issued to Venezuela, most of that to be repaid in oil. And so, yes, this was a very big part of the overall calculus. But over time, since 2015, but even preceding that, we've seen a real, I wouldn't say by any means a dismantling of the relationship, right? But the relationship has been strained as Venezuela has struggled to repay its loans, as delegations of Chinese advisors have headed to Caracas to try to advise on financial policy, on management of the oil sector, and have been warmly received, but not much has changed as a result of their advice. And so mismanagement, low productivity, corruption, a lot of issues have strained the relationship. And so we've seen, over time, really no new finance issued to Venezuela, right? And very little in the way of new investment. At the same time, a concerted effort to try to demonstrate strong political ties and, enduring support for the Maduro government. And while still also, striking strong relationships with others who may be influential within Venezuela from a leadership perspective. So at this juncture, the good question is how important Venezuela actually is to China. And to answer your second question, whether this is a blow, It is, right? It is a blow, in part because there has been a lot of time and effort spent cultivating these partnerships, right? Establishing a presence. Certainly, there are equity investments that are there, and that Chinese national oil companies are managing. The most productive fields in Venezuela at this juncture are those that Chinese companies are mining. And so anything that China has been doing right now is being called, I think, into question. The strength of these partnerships, the extent to which these networks of contacts will be sustained or will be productive, the future of these investments, right? And certainly the ability now of Venezuela to repay what outstanding debt, which amounts to approximately $10 billion by most calculations at this juncture, right, is all called into question. So a lot of uncertainty and indeed the prospect for some losses.
Thank you for that. I think that sets us up quite well. Turning to you, Tong, there is a theory out there that China might actually benefit from a stable post-Maduro Venezuela. Do you agree that this kind of quote unquote loss of an ideological ally might actually be an economic opportunity and a win for Beijing? And just from your thinking, how does this reshape China's long-term approach to Latin America?
Well, thank you, Jesse. I do see some Chinese oil industry experts making the assessment that, yes, they can foresee a scenario in which many years later, after U.S. successfully revitalizes the oil industry in the country, perhaps there will be a greater supply of oil from Venezuela to the global market. That's not necessarily bad news for China. Trump himself says, China can continue buying oil from the country. But again, that's based on many big ifs, right? Including whether U.S. has the capacity to do that. I think immediately, as Margaret says, there is a lot of Chinese concern about near-term loss, right? Chinese investment, Chinese oil for loan agreement with Venezuela, with all the oil vessels being intercepted by the United States. That oil is not going to go to China and repay China's loan. I think perhaps in an optimistic scenario, if indeed the former vice president who is now taking charge of the country is capable of stabilizing the overall economic and political situation, perhaps we can see China benefiting from that. But I think Beijing's concern is, even in that scenario, there is increasing sign. The American goal, especially under the Trump administration, is to achieve monopoly over the key assets, resources of the country, especially against major power competitors like China. So it's the optimistic scenario is not certain from China at all. And of course, China has a lot of skepticisms about America's capacity to stabilize the country's economic and political situation. So that's the current reflections I have seen from the Chinese expert discussions.
Thank you so much. I want to pass that question over to you, Margaret, as well. In the DC circle, do you see this perception that China could benefit from a stable post-Maduro Venezuela, or do you see the potential, as Tong pointed out, that this could be a move by the Trump administration to squeeze China out of Venezuela?
There are certainly those that have, expressed that view, that China could benefit in the future from a more stable situation in Venezuela, noting that, right, it's not been an optimal relationship to date, right? And there have been many complaints that Chinese, representatives have registered about their experiences in Venezuela. We've seen in other occasions in which, a more stable situation in various countries has enabled more in the way of Chinese investment, right, or other forms of engagement in support of China's economic interests. But, I couldn't agree more with the comments that were just made. All of this is based on a lot of ifs and when. There's a temporal element to this, right? It could take many, many years. And even the Trump administration has acknowledged that, right, to get things on stable ground. And, there's a long history also of great uncertainty and protracted engagements that may or may not result in more stable environments. If I could, I'd love to just add one point about what this all might mean for the rest of the region. And I think that's a question that most leaders in the region are asking at this juncture. And much of it depends, I think, on whether we believe that this operation had much to do with China, right? Or there were other motivating factors, and there are a wide range of opinions on that in Washington as well, right? And not a real clear consensus. Certainly, I would agree that trying to ensure that China does not have control over, policy making and certainly over strategic industries, sectors, right, in Venezuela is something that the Trump administration would aim to achieve with this move and future actions. But my sense is that, there were a wide range of considerations that motivated this, and China was not the top reason, right? Or China's engagement with Venezuela was not the top reason for taking this action at this particular juncture. That said, right, there has been a long history within the Trump administration, the Biden administration, right, and even Trump too, very recently of articulating concerns about the extent of Chinese engagement across the region. And so I think what most in the region are anticipating at this juncture is, more pressure from the U.S. government to limit activities, but to limit activities in very specific areas of concern to the U.S. government, and which have been articulated, I think, time and again related to specific projects that this administration and others have been concerned about.
I think I forgot to address, Jesse, your question. Because Margaret's comments reminds me, you asked me about also what the implications are for China's broader approach to the region. That's a key question facing China today, because at the strategic level, I think China is increasingly attracted to the possibility of a potential big deal with Trump. Perhaps China can persuade Trump to make important concessions in East Asia over issues of Chinese core interests like Taiwan, or make the United States drop some of the technology export restrictions to China. And the upcoming April summit will be a key opportunity for China to push for those American concessions. But in return, I think now China faces the potential need to yield some ground in the Western Hemisphere, a region that is clearly identified by the national security strategy as a region where the United States seeks dominance. I see a lot of initial debates about this key question in Beijing. There are also a few obstacles that would make China hard to make such concessions in the Western Hemisphere. One is, the region's importance to China, and Margaret mentioned this earlier. This region is not only economically interested because of the Belt and Road Initiative, but it's also geopolitically important to China. It is a key part of China's global design to engage the global South countries to build China's leadership among the global South. The recently released high-level policy paper on Latin America and Caribbean really demonstrates China's important long-term design to expand its footprint and influence in this region. So will China be able to give up, or at least slow roll that pre-planned expansion? Second, I think, is the question whether the U.S. efforts at consolidating regional dominance would help revitalize American global power. There is this argument that, in fact, the U.S. interest in regional dominance is because the U.S. recognizes it has to retrench to this region to better extract its resources in order to recover and revitalize. But if this regional dominance goes to contribute to a long-term U.S. revitalization at the global level, that would present a longer threat to China's global ambition, I think that would also make China hesitate to yield ground. And of course, there is this global narrative opportunity for China to use American norm-breaking behavior, its Monroe Doctrine mindset, to really undermine U.S. International image and soft power. And this is against the broader background of U.S. further retreating from global governance, including from many UN organizations, etc. So will China give up on the opportunity to launch an offense to lead regional countries to resist American, seeming hegemonism, to facilitate American decline? And of course, it boils down to ultimately Xi Jinping's personal view, right? She was very, insistent in competing with the United States, in controlling, key economic assets in this region, including, the port facilities near the Panama Canal. And it's Xi Jinping who wants to avoid making too much concession to the United States in order to avoid further emboldening the United States. So in practice, we may see China end up taking some mixture of these two efforts. It may make symbolic concessions, but to push for a more incremental and more subtle expansion, avoid triggering the bright red lines of the United States in the Western Hemisphere. And of course, whether China can succeed in doing so and in manipulating Trump will be witnessed in the upcoming bilateral leader summit in April. And the two leaders will also meet many more times, perhaps this year.
Thank you so much to both of you. I think you raised quite a breadth of threads that I would like to pull on in the conversation. But I think for me, one of the more immediate ones, Tong, which you raised, which I'll open up to both of you, is you outlined quite powerfully China's interests in maintaining its assets and maintaining its investments and its ties in Latin America. And I think, as you rightfully pointed out, President Trump has outlined in the national security strategy that hemispheric politics, there's this kind of return of what he calls the Donroe Doctrine. What options or what policy steps do you see China able to take to protect its interests in Latin America in the event that there is greater pressure asserted by the Trump administration for countries in the region to either divest or reduce their relations with China? And I'll pose that first to Margaret.
It is imperative at this juncture for China to engage with Latin America, right? Not just Latin America, but with markets all over the world. And I mean, just to reflect on the comments that were just made, that there was a moment in time, and it wasn't all that long ago, 2 decades, two and a half decades ago, that we saw a lot of writing in Chinese about the need to tread lightly in Latin America, right? To not ruffle feathers, to not upset the United States, especially in areas very close to the United States, but even in parts of South America, right, much further afield. And then we began to see less of that, a real change in narrative around the time that Xi Jinping assumed power, 2013 and following. And now I don't imagine that we'll see a complete reversal in terms of framing of this, but it's very interesting that now there are these debates underway about whether or not to engage and in what forms and how best to manage this particular situation while still protecting interests. And so, as I mentioned, right, it is critical for China to continue engaging. Why? Because Latin America factors very prominently as a source of all kinds of different commodities, many of which are part of and contribute greatly to China's energy security, food security, and supply chain security calculus at this juncture, right? It's also a critical market. We have seen a massive growth in especially certain kinds of exports to Latin America, which remains generally, receptive to these exports, although there have been some tensions in recent months and years, especially of those types of items that China is looking to export in greater quantities globally. It's, not something that I think China is going to be able to ease up on without generating major economic problems at home, whether in Latin America or other parts of the world. There's, in other words, this strategic imperative, right, to continue engaging. And then at the same time, this is critical for Latin American countries, right? It would be a disaster were China to extract itself, especially from a trade perspective, which, seems very unlikely, but is something that the U.S. has also mentioned. So what then can be done? My sense is that this particular administration, when it looks at Chinese engagement in Latin America, it is concerned about engagement in general, I think, and has stated that fairly clearly. But when we think through those types of projects and those areas of engagement that receive the most attention, it's mostly related to projects, investments, right, or trade-related agreements that intersect in some form with U.S. strategic interests, and especially that would be perceived as vulnerabilities in the event of some sort of future U.S. China military conflict. In that sense, we can think about, critical infrastructure, especially that with dual use capabilities or presumed dual use capabilities, right? There's a lot of concern about surveillance technologies, be they space, related or telecommunications related, all of these things. And so if there is a way, right, for Latin American countries and China, right, to carve out those particular deals and to think more critically about how to pursue those or whether or not to pursue those, I wonder to what extent that would be in some form a way to appease this particular administration. And at the same time, it would seem something of a capitulation, right? And maybe even emboldening, as was mentioned, right, the U.S. to further pursue this agenda.
Thank you, Margaret. I'd like to pass it over to you, Tong, to also provide a response on where you see China has optionality and pushback if we do see that move. But also, I just also want to flag, in a recent piece you published with the Carnegie website, you did address the debate over kinetic action in Venezuela and whether it serves as a deterrent for China or as a distraction for the U.S. military. And you suggest Beijing's takeaway might be a bit different than what Washington intends. In your addressing of the last question, can you explain maybe why Chinese leadership might view the Maduro regime's collapse not necessarily as a sign of U.S. strength, but potentially even as a gift, similar to the U.S. war in Iraq and other places, as a conflict where the U.S. may become bogged down in its own backyard?
Well, on your former question, Jesse, I think Margaret has provided a very good comprehensive answer. I'll just add two very quick comments. One is, I think one thing for China to do is to focus on its expansion of investment and cooperation and influence in less sensitive areas like clean energy cooperation, civil space, cybersecurity, technology, AI, right? China's AI global governance initiative. There are so many areas China can foster deeper cooperation that wouldn't trigger, I think, immediate red flag from Washington. Even on security issues, if China needs to lay down a little bit on a high-profile military cooperation and military exercises, it can still police cooperation efforts that can help government enhance internal security and stability. That has been a useful tool for China to build relations with certain governments. And traditionally, China was more skillful and experienced in building elite diplomacy. I think the recent regime change in Venezuela reminds China it has to go much deeper and broader than simply focusing on elites. It has to build incrementally comprehensive economic, social connections with all sectors of a country. The recent embarrassment of China for sending a special envoy to meet with Maduro just hours before the military operation really showed Chinese shortage in local intelligence capability. And that type of capacity needs to be built over a long time through broad and systematic investment into the social economic system, the social economic fabric of local countries. So I think that will be Chinese longer term focus. To answer your question about how this U.S. operation might send a signal about U.S. military, a strong deterrence, and whether it creates risk of bogging the United States down in its own backyard. I think firstly, I would agree. It shows U.S. military strength. It surprised many Chinese strategists. U.S. had zero casualty in this, very impressive operation. But I think Chinese experts also raised some caveats. Firstly, the U.S. pulled this off because it was against a much weaker country with a much weaker military. The asymmetric capability between the two sides is too significant. And second, it mostly showcased American special forces capability, which is a particular type of military capability that may not represent a country's overall military strength. And of course, this is an area with Chinese weakness. So China, I think, will try to fill the gap. But China is not deeply convinced that suddenly, somehow China itself might be under such American military threat. But it does, I think, demonstrate a U.S. will, political will, to use its hard force to advance national interests, something that I think so far China has underestimated. But even on this, Chinese strategists have observed that the U.S. use on military is very limited. And similar to the U.S. targeted bombing of Iranian nuclear facilities last year, it was very limited use of military tool, and there was clear effort to avoid broadening the military operation. So it still shows Trump's interest in aversing risks. I think China sees a lot of opportunities for the United States to bog down in the region. Its strategic design over this military operation is lacking from Beijing's perspective. U.S. officials threw out too many different justifications: the drugs, immigrants from the country's oil and resources. This is an effort for the United States to win back respect by demonstrating force. This could help promote democratic domino in the region. But eventually, Beijing thinks this reflects overall chaos and the impulsive decision-making in the Trump White House. And in Venezuela, it's very unclear how the political situation might further develop. Will the United States be able to remain effective control over different domestic actors, security forces, maintain order, and create the necessary conditions for economic stabilization? That's totally uncertain from Beijing's perspective. And again, in the broader region, with new threats against Cuba, Colombia, Mexico, etc. What happens if these countries do not concede to U.S. demands? Will U.S. commit further resources, etc., and even beyond Latin America to Greenland, another part of the Western Hemisphere? It creates opportunity to undermine NATO. It helps relieve China's overall military threat at the global level if NATO is undermined. So there will be no more Chinese concern about so-called Asian NATO at Chinese doorstep. If we recall so far, U.S. hasn't really pivoted to Asia. And so now with U.S. focusing on extracting resources from the region, Beijing expects greater displeasure from regional countries, and that means many more opportunities for China and Russia to exploit, to further sabotage U.S. effort, and to further distract the United States.
Thank you so much, Tong. I appreciate that. We're coming down to the last few minutes, so I'd like to shift the conversation slightly from the Western Hemisphere over to Asia Pacific. And I think when we look at the range of commentary in Washington, D.C., in Beijing, even in Europe and different places, the Taiwan parallel has naturally resurfaced repeatedly in the last few days. Even though the comparison is imperfect, what lesson, if any, does this episode hold for Taiwan?
There are so many debates about the implications for Taiwan. Firstly, I think it's clear this will not significantly accelerate China's timetable to unify Taiwan. But the important thing is it will very likely reduce the cost for China to unify Taiwan, especially by reducing international response. I think there are many analysts who are saying, well, this wouldn't affect Beijing's behavior or calculations because Beijing already doesn't care about international law or norms. And Beijing already defines the Taiwan issue as an internal affair. So it's not about attacking or invading another country. So all the international laws already do not apply from Beijing's perspective. But I think what these experts are missing is it will likely make international community feel much more difficult to work together if China invades Taiwan and deliver an effective response. Because China could easily accuse those countries as practicing double standard when they basically accepted United States violating another country's sovereignty while China was simply trying to resolve an internal affair. And in fact, international response is very important for a Chinese successful military operation over Taiwan. If there's united international response, China will have to deal with potentially very serious economic sanctions and political isolation. And it probably would undermine China's military capability to fight and sustain a prolonged war. And even if China was able to secure a decisive, quick attack, Beijing thinks after the Venezuela operation, it is more likely the international community will resign and wouldn't be able to organize a coordinated and effective response. I think what's different is, of course, U.S. has superiority over Venezuela, but doesn't have military superiority over China against Taiwan in the Taiwan Strait. But here, I think China has increasing military advantage. It is becoming more confident. In fact, even the United States recognizes declining American military superiority to the extent many Washington strategists are talking about the need to force China to concede by threatening nuclear escalation. So in other words, the U.S. is now lacking more effective and credible military options. What matters, of course, more is the U.S. will to use force in the Taiwan scenario, and the Venezuela attack did demonstrate U.S. will to do so, but does that apply to the Taiwan Strait? The national security strategy says the U.S. priority is Western Hemisphere, and the U.S. would rely on presidential diplomacy, meaning the mere time and attention of the president to preserve peace in other places, not of immediate core interests to the United States. So this might, in fact, tempt Beijing to test through both diplomatic and military means, where does Trump's definition of core immediate American interest rests on the map? So I think that's where the risk will be very significant.
Thank you so much, Tong. I think you raised a lot of very helpful questions that will continue to be discussed in the coming days and weeks and potentially months as we look at the broader implications for the example of Venezuela in the Taiwan question. Passing over to you, Margaret. The U.S. national security strategy elevates the Western Hemisphere. You both talked at length about this as kind of a core U.S. interest. And Secretary of State Rubio has made no secret of his desire to see a quote-unquote democratic domino effect following Venezuela, with potential implications across the region, including Cuba and in Panama. How might the events in Venezuela and just the broader shift in U.S. posture, what does this mean moving forward for China in the region? And I want to give you the last space to kind of give us the what if and what next, if you don't mind.
I wish I had a crystal ball. I'm afraid, it's my sense that we don't have a clear sense of how this particular operation, right, and this Venezuela contingency, right, translates to, or even fits within the context of the national security strategy, or the Monroe Doctrine, or the Don Monroe Doctrine, or however we're going to frame it, right? What is that really? What is the U.S. commitment to the region? And then is this a one-off thing, or is this a sign of things to come? And are we going to see, a real focus on just a handful of very particular issues that happen to be of interest to those that are formulating, Western Hemisphere policy at this juncture? For instance, Venezuela, Cuba, right? Those that have been mentioned by name. Or are we going to see something much broader, much more hemispheric in nature, and then translating across all parts of the region? And we don't have the answers to those questions. And so, the effect on the region and the effect on China remain to be seen. I think the effect on the U.S. too, right? To the the extent that the U.S. becomes bogged down essentially in a long-standing engagement in Venezuela, looking to ensure some degree of stability in that country. And so until we have some clarity on that, it's very difficult to make any clear predictions. What I will say is that, Latin America, by and large, is not on board, right, with the plans that have been, set forth. And that's not to say that there wasn't excitement in the region. We saw it on the streets, right, in Colombia. We saw it in Venezuela. We saw it in Miami and other parts of the region about the removal of Maduro. And that was a real surprise to, I think, a lot of those who were observing this, the extent of that response. But there are also those governments in the region that are quite terrified, frankly, about what is next to come and what they should expect from this administration on wide-ranging issues that may intersect with U.S. interests. And one thing that we are seeing, though, I think across the board, and this has preceded the Trump administration, is a real effort to diversify partnerships away from the United States, but also away from China, right? Understanding that this is not, it doesn't make good strategic sense to rely too heavily on one partner or another, whether from a trade perspective or political perspective, and that diversification is the name of the game. And if anything, this new EU-Mercosur deal, right, which was just finalized, is a very clear indication and good example of that.
Thank you so much for those concluding comments, sharing your thoughts and your insights with us today. I would also like to thank the National Committee staff members behind the scenes who have made today's interview possible. We hope those who have tuned in today found the interview both interesting and informative. I certainly have, and I hope you have as well. And we hope that you will join us for future National Committee programming. Thank you all again, and we look forward to the next conversation.